You are 6 years old, and the courtyard stones are still warm from the sun. Your mother kneels in front of you like she's about to tie your shoe, like she's about to make everything safe. Her hands smell faintly of soap and dried herbs. Then she takes your foot in her palm, gentle as a lullaby, and you feel, before you understand, how tightly love can hold. The cloth appears, long and clean, and prepared in silence. You try to pull back, laughing once, because you think this is a game. Then her thumb presses down, her fingers lever the smallest bones the wrong way, and the sound that follows is not a scream. It is a crack. It is the moment childhood learns a new definition for the word beautiful. What you've just stepped into, what millions of girls stepped into, was not a one-off cruelty, not an isolated madness hidden behind one door. It was a system with rules, with aesthetics, with status, with mothers who insisted they were doing the only loving thing they could. This was the golden lotus ritual, the practice the outside world would come to call Chinese foot binding, a tradition that shaped the lives, marriages, and bodies of women for centuries. It flourished in a society that could produce breathtaking poetry about grace while also demanding that grace be manufactured from broken bones. And the most unsettling part is not that men wanted it. History is full of male desires written into law and custom. The unsettling part is how often the hands doing the binding were female, and how often the voice whispering, "Endure," was a mother's. In one household, a girl might be told it began as refinement, a simple shaping, a small sacrifice for a great future. In another, she would be told nothing at all, because explanation only makes resistance louder. Either way, the logic was the same. A smaller foot meant a better match. A better match meant security. Security meant survival. When survival is the prize, pain starts to look negotiable. And somewhere in that moral arithmetic, tenderness and brutality learn to share the same room. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Every time I cover a story like this, I'm stunned that the past can still reach across the world and grab us by the throat. In the beginning, it rarely looks like torture. It looks like preparation. A mother chooses a season when the cold will numb the swelling, when the air itself becomes a quiet accomplice. She chooses cloth that won't rip, thread that won't snap, and a needle sharp enough to make the work clean. The child is bathed. The toenails are cut down hard, cut down so they won't pierce the flesh later, cut down so there will be less infection, less stink, less shame. Someone heats water, and the steam carries the smell of herbs, sometimes for pain, sometimes for luck, sometimes just because tradition demands the scent of medicine. And the girl sits there, watching the grown women move with purpose, sensing, because children always sense, that whatever comes next has already been decided. Then the foot is taken. The toes, except the big one, are folded under. Not bent politely, not coaxed, but forced. Each small bone resists for a moment like a stubborn twig, and then it yields with a sound that is too dry to be real. The arch is pushed upward until the midfoot breaks, because the goal is not merely smallness. The goal is a shape, a high, steep curve that turns a foot into a crescent. Blood begins as pinpricks and becomes a warm slickness. The cloth is wrapped tight, tighter, tight enough to make the foot forget its old outline. The binding is pulled with a force that drags the child forward on her hands. And when she tries to kick free, when she tries to twist, the adult grip becomes iron. Because in this ritual, mercy is considered sabotage. Afterward, the foot is not allowed to rest in the way you imagine rest. The girl is made to stand. She is made to take steps because pressure reshapes what pain has broken. Every step presses the folded toes deeper underneath. Every step grinds the fractured arch. She is told to walk so the bones will learn their new position. She is told that walking will make the binding take. And as she limps across the floor, leaving small damp marks behind her, the women watch with a kind of grim attentiveness, not because they enjoy it, but because they know the price of doing it badly. A loose wrap means failure. A failed binding means a future that closes like a door. In some homes, the father is not present. In others, He is present only as an unseen force, as a goal, as the imagined approval on the other side of the suffering. But the mother is always there, and that is what makes this story so difficult to swallow. Because when a stranger harms you, it is easier to locate evil. When a mother harms you, the mind scrambles for a way to survive the contradiction. The girl must believe her mother loves her, because the alternative is unbearable. And so she learns to translate. Pain becomes proof. Obedience becomes safety. Silence becomes maturity. She learns to smile through it, because smiles are currency in a world that praises female endurance. The ritual does not end in a day. It becomes a calendar. The bindings come off, then on again, then tighter again, week after week, month after month, year after year. The foot is washed in water that stings like fire where the skin has split. The flesh is inspected like an investment. Blisters are opened, wounds are scraped. If infection appears, it is treated if possible, hidden if not. In some cases, rot is not merely tolerated, it is useful. Tissue that dies and falls away reduces the size. The body becomes a sculptor's material, and decay becomes part of the toolkit. The girl learns the smell of herself in a way no child should. She learns that the human body can become an enemy without dying. The family might call the ideal result Lotus, but the reality is more like a permanent wound carefully maintained. The bound foot is compressed until the heel and the ball of the foot are forced closer together, making the foot shorter. The big toe is left pointing forward to preserve some balance, but even it is strained, its joint warped by the unnatural weight. The smaller toes, folded underneath, may fuse in their bent positions. The arch, once broken, may heal into a steep curve, which changes the entire geometry of walking. The ankles weaken, the calves tighten. The gait becomes a careful sway, part pain management, part performance. And the society that demanded this gait then romanticized it, calling it delicate, calling it erotic, calling it a sign of refinement, as if the wobble of a damaged body was a dance chosen freely. Now imagine the girl grows older. Imagine she is 12, 13, 14. The pain does not disappear. It changes texture. It becomes a constant pressure, a dull throb that flares into sharpness whenever the binding is tightened again. It becomes the background noise of her life, as ordinary as hunger. She learns to plan her movements, to choose where she steps, to avoid long distances, to conserve strength. She learns to sit gracefully because standing too long is punishment. She learns to keep her feet hidden because the ideal is admired, but the process is not meant to be witnessed by outsiders. Beauty, in this system, is supposed to appear effortless. The labor of suffering must be concealed like the labor of servants. And then one day, the first curiosity spike hits like a slap. Because the bound foot was not only about what men wanted, it was also about what families needed. In many communities, a woman's marriage could determine the survival of an entire household. A good match could bring food security, social protection, and a network that might save everyone when famine, illness, or political chaos arrived. So, foot binding was not merely vanity. It became a strategy. One carried out on the bodies of children because children had no bargaining power. A mother who had endured the same ritual might look at her daughter and see not a victim, but a version of herself that might escape poverty if the binding succeeded. The cruelty could wear the mask of calculation, and the calculation could wear the mask of love. This is where we need a human anchor, someone to follow, not because one story can represent millions, but because the mind needs a face to hold on to when the history becomes too large. So, picture a girl we'll call Lynn, not because we can retrieve her exact name from the dust, but because Lynn is every girl whose childhood was rewritten by bandages. Lynn lives in a home where her mother's hands are always busy, mending, washing, counting, worrying. Her father is not a monster. He is simply a man shaped by expectations. He wants a respectable marriage for his daughter because respectability is a form of armor in their world. Lynn's mother knows the math. Lynn's mother also knows the pain, and that means she knows exactly how hard to pull. The day Lynn's binding begins, she is told a story. Not of bones, not of blood, but of flowers. The golden lotus is described like a treasure, like a secret key. Lynn hears the words and tries to imagine a lotus in her own body, something blooming, something admired, and then her toes are folded under, and she realizes the bloom is not a metaphor. It is the shape her foot will be forced to resemble, whether she wants it or not. When she screams, her mother's face tightens, not with pleasure, but with a kind of terror, as if Lynn's resistance threatens to ruin everything. The mother whispers, "Hush, hush. This is for you." And Lynn's mind, desperate to make sense of the impossible, clings to that sentence like a rope. Weeks pass. Lynn's world shrinks to the size of her own feet. Her friends run outside, and she watches from a doorway, learning envy like a new language. When she tries to join them, the first few steps feel like nails being driven into her soles. She falls, and the fall makes the broken bones shift. The pain is so bright it feels like light. She cries until she can't cry anymore. And then, because children adapt in ways that break your heart, she learns to cry quietly, because loud crying earns scolding. And scolding feels like betrayal stacked on betrayal. Here comes the second curiosity spike, the hidden rule that makes the whole practice even more sinister. Foot binding wasn't one uniform ritual practiced identically everywhere. It varied by region, by class, by household. Some families bound tightly for the smallest possible foot. Others bound less severely, aiming for a smaller shape without the extreme 3-inch ideal. Some working-class women had bound feet but still labored. Their bodies became proof that the practice was never purely about idleness, even if it was marketed that way. And yet across these variations, the social message stayed consistent. A woman's body was not her own. It was a project managed by family and judged by strangers. The degree of suffering might change, but the logic of control did not. Lynn's mother begins to talk about marriage in half sentences, in hints. When you are older, someday. Lynn hears these words and feels a chill, because she understands that her future is already being negotiated in conversations she is not allowed to enter. She begins to notice visiting women glancing downward, as if they can see through cloth and shoes into the truth beneath. Sometimes a visitor smiles approvingly, and her mother's shoulders loosen with relief. Lynn learns that her pain has an audience even when she thinks she is alone. As Lynn grows, the consequences deepen. Her bound feet limit her movement, which limits her social world, which limits her education, which limits her choices. The ritual doesn't just reshape bone, it reshapes possibility. And that is the point. A woman who cannot easily leave the home is easier to control. A woman who depends on others for mobility is easier to monitor. Whether every family consciously understood this political dimension is beside the point. The system benefits from it either way. But Lynn is not only a victim of control. She is also a child with a mind that refuses to stop asking questions, even when questions are dangerous. At night, she touches her wrapped foot and tries to imagine what it used to look like. She tries to remember the feeling of toes stretching, of running without thought. Memory becomes a form of mourning, and mourning becomes a form of rage she cannot express openly. She begins to observe her mother more closely, searching for cracks in the armor. She sees her mother's hands tremble when rewrapping the bindings. She sees her mother pause, exhale, then pull tighter anyway. And Lynn realizes something that terrifies her. Her mother is not doing this because she is cruel. She is doing it because she believes cruelty is the price of safety. That's the third spike, the moral contradiction that refuses to resolve. When oppression is normalized, the oppressor is not always a villain. Sometimes the oppressor is a frightened parent repeating what was done to her, trying to buy her child a future with the only currency she believes the world accepts. The tragedy becomes generational, not because people are blind, but because they can see too well what happens to girls who don't conform. Lynn eventually reaches the age when the binding is considered successful. The foot is small enough to fit the desired shoes. shoes embroidered with beauty so elaborate they look like miniature paintings. The shoes are proof of achievement, proof that the family did what it was supposed to do. But inside the shoe is a foot that does not feel like a foot. It feels like an object that belongs to someone else. The toes are folded, the arch is high, the skin is tough in some places and fragile in others. Lynn walks with the careful sway she has practiced for years. People call it graceful. Lynn knows it is survival. Then the marriage negotiations begin in earnest. A matchmaker visits. Compliments are exchanged. Tea is poured. Lynn is presented like a quiet painting in the room, expected to smile, expected to look modest, expected to be grateful for the scrutiny. The matchmaker talks about her lotus feet with the tone one might use for a rare jewel. And Lynn sits there, hearing her own body turned into a selling point, hearing the pain of her childhood translated into the language of value. In some versions of this story, the girl is rescued by modernity, by reform, by an enlightened father who refuses the ritual. But history is not usually that neat. For many, there was no rescue. There was only endurance and adaptation. Lynn is married. She leaves her mother's home and enters another household where her body is judged anew. Her bound feet become a symbol of her worth, but they also become a limitation that makes her dependent on the new family's goodwill. If she is treated kindly, the kindness is conditional. If she is treated harshly, she has fewer ways to escape. The binding follows her like a shadow, not because the cloth remains, but because the shape remains. And yet, even in this bleak architecture, human beings are never only what the system demands. Lynn finds moments of tenderness, perhaps with another woman in the household, perhaps with a child she later holds in her arms. She learns to laugh again, but the laughter has a different edge now. She learns to love, but love is complicated when you know what people can do in the name of love. Years pass. The world changes slowly, then quickly. Ideas travel. Criticism of foot binding grows louder in some circles, framed as reform, framed as national strength, framed as modernization, framed as morality. But for women like Lynn, the debates arrive too late. Their bodies carry the past like scars that cannot be argued away. They watch younger girls in some places begin to go unbound, and they feel something that is not purely joy. It is joy mixed with grief. Grief for what was taken from them. Grief for the fact that their suffering, once praised, is now spoken of as a shameful mistake. Imagine being told your pain was virtue your whole life, only to live long enough to hear it called cruelty. That reversal is its own kind of wound. Now the story pulls back and the tone shifts, because legacy is not just what a practice does in the moment, it's what it leaves behind in minds, in families, in cultural memory. Foot binding shaped not only women's mobility, but also the architecture of domestic life, the division of labor, and the aesthetics of femininity. It became a filter through which women were judged, a marker used to sort who was considered marriageable, respectable, or proper. It also left behind artifacts that are deceptively beautiful. Tiny lotus shoes embroidered with intricate patterns, objects that can sit behind glass in a museum and look like delicate art. But when you know what they were for, they stop being cute. They become haunting. They are proof that pain can be decorated, that suffering can be made fashionable, that a culture can build elegance on top of injury and call it civilization. There is a particular kind of silence that follows practices like this. Families didn't always talk about it openly. Mothers didn't always confess their doubts. Daughters didn't always describe their anger. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was survival. They remembered. They recorded in fragments. They avoided looking directly at what they'd endured because staring too long might break them. And in that silence, the paradox endured. A ritual done for women that harmed women, a tradition described as beauty that required cruelty, a symbol of refinement that began with a child's bones snapping under her mother's hands. When people today ask, how could they do that? The honest answer is uncomfortable, because it points back at us. Human beings can be taught to confuse suffering with worth. They can be taught to believe that pain is the entry fee for love, status, or safety. They can be taught to accept rituals that destroy bodies if the alternative is exclusion. The Golden Lotus ritual is not only a story about China. It is a story about how any society, anywhere, can turn a human body into a battlefield and then write poetry about the victory. And so we return to the courtyard, to that warm stone, to the moment when childhood learns the sound of bone breaking. The light is still golden. The bandages are still clean. The mother's hands are still steady. And the girl, years later, will remember not just the pain, but the tenderness that came before it. Because the tenderness is what makes the pain so confusing. She will remember the way her mother held her, the way her mother whispered, the way her mother insisted this was love. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all. Not the tiny shoes, not the altered gait, not even the shattered bones, but the way a child can be taught that the person hurting her might also be the person saving her. The lotus blooms, the foot heals wrong, the world applauds. And somewhere inside that applause, a little girl keeps listening for the crack,